Welcome to Ethos Trek. This is, and another thing. Let's talk about accountability today. Specifically, I want to talk about who it applies to and who it doesn't, and why that asymmetry is not an accident. There's a story in the news this week that I think most people are going to miss because it's buried in legal filings and it doesn't have a clean villain with a smoking gun. But the pattern it reveals is one of the most corrosive things in American democracy right now. And it connects to something much bigger than one senator from Iowa. Let's start with the facts. Here's the situation. Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican, Iowa, 91 years old, current chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, has been named in two separate federal lawsuits as a significant factor in the firing of decorated FBI agents, not as a named defendant, as the precipitating cause. Here's what the lawsuits describe. Grassley released unredacted materials from a federal investigation called Arctic Frost. The FBI operation that preceded Jack Smith's criminal probes into Donald Trump. Those documents identified agents by name. The day after Grassley's document release, FBI Director Kash Patel fired one of those agents. That agent was literally on his way out the door with his kids to go trick-or-treating when he got the call. A few days later, a second agent was terminated. A third faced personnel action. The suits describe a coordinated timeline. We've seen this pattern before. Grassley releases the names. Trump allies publicly brand the agents as quote-unquote corrupt and quote partisan operatives, unquote. Patel fires them. Agents with spotless records, consistent, quote-unquote, exemplary performance reviews. No due process, no hearing, no explanation given. The lawsuits name Patel and Attorney General Pam Bondi as defendants. Grassley is not named. And here's the reason being floated for why. He may have been too old to know what he was doing. I want to say that again. The argument, not from Grassley's critics, but effectively from the legal architecture protecting him, is that the sitting chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, one of the most powerful positions in the United States government, may not be fully culpable because of his age and capacity. Chuck Grassley is 91 years old. He was re-elected in 2022. His term runs until January 2029. He will be 95 years old if he serves it out. And that's where I want to zoom out, because this isn't about one man. This is about a system. The United States Constitution has no mechanism, none, to address the incapacity of a sitting member of Congress. The 25th Amendment covers presidential incapacity. Congress wrote themselves no equivalent. That is not an oversight. That is a choice. Under the law, as it stands, a member of Congress can be physically absent for years, can be cognitively unable to read the legislation they're voting on, can have their votes directed by unelected staff, handing them a piece of paper on the way to the floor. And there is no process to declare the seat vacant, no review, no remedy. The Congressional Research Service has confirmed it plainly. Never in American history has a sitting member of Congress been removed from office due to incapacitation. Let me give you a few examples of what that looks like in practice. Republican Representative Kay Granger of Texas cast her last vote on July 24, 2024. She missed every single vote after that date for the remainder of her term, including a vote on preventing a government shutdown. Her son later confirmed that she had been dealing with dementia issues. Her district office closed before Thanksgiving. Calls went to voicemail. She attended a portrait unveiling in Washington, celebrated by her colleagues, while her constituents had no functional representation. Senator Dianne Feinstein, and I'm including her because this is a bipartisan structural failure, not a partisan one, had a covert system in place in her final years where staff would walk alongside her whenever she left her office, without her knowledge, to prevent unsupervised contact with reporters. She forgot she had been briefed on topics within the same meeting. She asked the same questions in hearings twice. The New York Times reported she was, by all accounts, in the later stages of dementia in her final years in office. She died in September 2023, still serving, still counted in the majority, still affecting the composition of the Judiciary Committee. Senator Strom Thurmond spent his final year in office living at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Aides had to help him out of his wheelchair to sit at the presiding officer's desk for his final session. He read his closing statement from a printout in large letters. He was 100 years old. He died 6 months after leaving office, and throughout his decline, his party said nothing because his vote still counted and his chairmanship still served a purpose, and the institution protected itself. A Capitol Hill pharmacist made headlines years ago when he revealed he was filling Alzheimer's prescriptions for members of Congress. Not one member, members, plural. Now, I want to be very precise about something. This is not an argument that people with disabilities cannot or should not serve. Disability is not the issue. Assistive devices are not the issue. Physical limitation is not the issue. Franklin Roosevelt governed through a world war. There are members serving today with significant physical limitations who are doing the job better than half of the so-called able-bodied people in that building. The issue, the only issue, is functional capacity to exercise independent judgment on behalf of the people who sent you there. That is the job. That is what voters consented to. When a senator cannot remember her own briefings, her constituents are not being represented by the person they elected. They are being represented by whoever is handling the piece of paper on the way to the floor. Those people were never on any ballot. The governed did not consent to them. That is not a gray area. That is a broken contract. Now, let's talk about the party that has spent the last 3 years, making Joe Biden's age the centerpiece of their political messaging. The same party that ran Mitch McConnell as minority leader while he froze on camera twice in front of rolling news cameras, had a concussion, and required aides to help navigate his schedule. The same party that had Kay Granger disappear from the floor for months while they needed every single vote they could get, and said nothing, did nothing, called no one to account. The same party that just floated, quote, maybe he was too old to know what he was doing, unquote, as a defense for the man currently chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee. You do not get to wield age as a weapon against your opponents, and then deploy it as a shield for your own. That is not a political position. That is not even hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. That is the deliberate weaponization of a standard you have no intention of applying to yourself. Now, let's talk about term limits, because that is the other promise this party made and quietly buried. The contract with America, 1994. Freshman Republicans came to Washington signing pledges to serve 3 terms and go home. It was a cornerstone of the revolution they claimed to be leading. You know how many of them kept that pledge? A handful. The rest let it expire, stayed, accumulated seniority, accumulated chairmanships, accumulated power, and the promise became a talking point they dusted off whenever it was useful and folded away whenever it wasn't. Chuck Grassley has been in the Senate since 1981. That's 44 years. He has chaired the Judiciary Committee. He has shaped the federal bench for decades. And now, the legal argument being constructed around his role in the firing of decorated federal agents is that he may not have fully understood what he was doing. 44 years. And the exit ramp is, quote, he might not have known, unquote. Here is the parallel they don't want you to make. The Republican Party has spent years arguing that tenure must be eliminated for university professors. Their argument goes like this: tenure protects underperformers. It allows people with the wrong ideas to hold positions of influence indefinitely. It removes the institution's ability to respond when someone is no longer serving the function they were hired for. It insulates people from accountability. And taxpayers shouldn't be funding positions held by people who can't or won't perform their duties. I want you to hold that argument in your mind for a moment. Let it stew. Now apply it to Congress. Tenure protects underperformers. So does lifelong incumbency with no accountability mechanism for incapacity. It allows people to hold positions of influence indefinitely. So does a Senate seat with no term limits, no performance review, and no process for removal when a member can no longer do the job. It removes the institution's ability to respond. The institution of Congress has no ability to respond to incapacity. None. That is documented fact. It insulates people from accountability. A tenured professor can still face post-tenure review. They can be sanctioned for misconduct. They can, in extreme cases, be removed for cause. Congress has none of those mechanisms. Not one. And taxpayers shouldn't fund positions held by people who can't perform their duties. A professor who stops showing up to class gets fired. A congresswoman who stops showing up to vote gets a portrait unveiling. A professor with documented cognitive decline can be removed through institutional process. A senator with documented cognitive decline casts deciding votes on lifetime judicial appointments until she dies in office, and her party blocks her temporary replacement on the committee she can no longer attend. If accountability is the value, if that is genuinely the value and not just the rhetorical weapon you reach for when it's convenient, then it has to be the value everywhere. You do not get a selective accountability doctrine. That is not accountability. That is dominance dressed up in the language of principle. So, what would actual accountability look like? It would look like a congressional incapacity mechanism, something modeled on the 25th Amendment that gives the institution a formal, transparent process for addressing situations where a member cannot perform the duties of office. Not a partisan weapon, a process with standards, with review, with due process, something the institution could apply consistently and transparently to both parties, regardless of which way the seat tilts. It would look like term limits with a cycling structure, not a hard career ban, but a required sit-out period. 3 terms, then you must step aside for 2 cycles. You can come back. Your experience doesn't disappear, but the seat cannot become a permanent possession. The seniority system that rewards staying forever and that gives incapacitated members and their parties every incentive to keep a warm body in the chair regardless of what that body can still do, gets broken up. Power stops calcifying around individuals who have outlasted their capacity to exercise it. And it would look like honesty about what the consent of the governed actually requires. Consent isn't satisfied by putting a name on a ballot once every 6 years. Consent is an ongoing relationship between the represented and their representative. When that relationship is severed, when the person casting votes on your behalf can no longer meaningfully understand what they're voting on, the contract is broken. The seat is being held by an apparatus, not a person, and the governed have every right to demand better than that. Chuck Grassley is 91 years old. He chairs the committee that shapes the federal judiciary. Lawsuits are being built around the argument that he may not have been fully aware of the consequences of his actions. And he is still in that chair. That is not an argument about one senator. That is a portrait of a system that has decided accountability is for other people. The same rules have to apply. That's not a radical idea. It's the only idea that makes democracy mean something. I'm Sarah Grey. This is And Another Thing on Ethos Trek.